We are in week 2 of our exploration of the intersection between African mythology and folklore and psychology. And I'm very excited about this week's episode because it's taking on a different format than we have done before. Specifically, we have a guest. We'll start with a reading, as I promised last week, a short summary of the story and the discussion, and then we'll launch into the conversation with our guest. The focus of this week's episode will be on the phenomenon which I am calling the My Village People phenomenon. And if you are familiar with African circles, you probably know what this is. This is the idea that some people believe in, that if they are not succeeding in life, it is because their village people are holding them back. And this is something that shows up quite a bit across the continent. I am quite looking forward to this conversation, so let's get right into it. Hello, friends, and welcome to the Mythological Africans podcast, where we read and talk about stories from African mythology and folklore. I am your host, Helen Nde. If you've been following along with Mythological Africans for all these years, then you probably know that there is one person in the world with whom I talk a lot about matters that would be important to Mythological Africans. This is a person I ask all my questions if I want to get the perspective from my village. And this is the person who I bug with all my crazy lines of thinking, trying to see if I'm making sense at all. And it helps that this person shares a house with me and is also one of my favorite people in the world. And this person is my mom. Hey, Mama.
Hey.
Welcome to the show.
Thank you. I'm glad to be on this show this evening. And I know, Helen, this topic is close to your heart because we've talked about it.
Yeah, we have.
And I'm glad to be here to share some of my thoughts.
And this is not your first time on Mythological Africans. If you recall way back in the day when Mythological Africans had conversation on Twitter, and we actually had you as a guest. At that time, we got to read some of the stories from your short story collection, because my mom is a writer as well. And we got to talk about the stories, and it was quite a good conversation. It was a pleasure to share that space with you. I know you have your own interests, you have your own way that you approach Cameroonian culture in your writing, the way you showcase it, the way you examine and challenge and interrogate it. So I'm excited to be having this conversation with you. I can't think of a better person to have this conversation with. So are you ready?
Sure, I'm ready.
All right. So the My Village People phenomenon, we've had quite a few conversations about it up till this point. What comes to mind when you hear this whole My Village People thing?
I want to begin by saying the whole concept of My Village People, as you conceive it, to me, it has that coating of a support system. But in that support system, there are certain things that come up. Let me take the example of my paternal grandfather's compound where I lived for some time. The village setting at that time was very close-knit, and everybody was involved in everybody else's business. And the family was compact. That is, you find the sons living their homes. Their parents will give them land next to theirs and they will start building their own family. So you would have 2, 3, 4 generations of one family occupying the same space of land in the village. And in those days, it was not common for people to leave the village and move out. But with the coming of colonization and the creation of plantations in the southwest and urban towns cropping up, the younger people felt it necessary to go out and find another way of living. This was not welcome. And each time a young man had to leave the village to go to the plantations, it was something that the villagers looked on as, well, he's abandoning us. So, this idea of people leaving the village and moving out was something very strange, and the people did not welcome it. So when you leave the village, for example, without the consent of the family, and when I say the family, I'm not talking about the nuclear family, the extended family of aunts and uncles and grandparents, without their acceptance, you are going out there, and your going is accompanied by what we call a way in Bafanji. That's a curse. They say, as you are going without our blessing, you never see good out there. That is the basis of this feeling of some curse following you wherever you go. And the people believe so much in that. And it's even worse when it comes to women, because girls were betrothed when they were young. And if you were courageous enough to rebel and leave the village, this curse will follow you. Some of these women don't get married. Some of them come back to the village, and some find the life so hard out there that they feel it's because they left the village without the blessing of the people. So this idea of my village people being responsible for my misfortune out there is something that is still in the villages today.
I appreciate that context because what I find quite often is that the things that we come to find out to not be ideal usually start from a good place. As they say, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. And so what I heard in your explanation is that this concept, at least the way you see it, emerges out of a context of care, of harmony, a context where people were expected to work together to build something solid, to continue building the prosperity of the family, in building the prestige, in contributing something to the greatness, that the coherence of the family. And then circumstances arrive which destabilize that, which introduce some disharmony. And that's important because in many traditional African contexts, harmony is the ideal, is the ultimate goal. And this comes with challenges because the world is not naturally a harmonious place, right? There is this thing called entropy in physics, which means chaos is more the norm in many cases. And so harmony takes intentionality. And sometimes this intentionality doesn't manifest in the best possible ways, like we see here. Because I can think of a situation where if it's a young man looking at his options in the village, he might just want something more for himself, right?
Exactly.
He might feel the call to adventure, and because he goes against the wishes of the family. And like you rightly said, the family is not just mother, father, siblings. Family is that extended unit, that establishment, so to speak. Or a young woman who's betrothed to someone who she doesn't want to marry and goes in the opposite direction. And if these individuals are not coming out of a context that is supportive, so it's almost like a dysfunction of what is supposed to be a supportive environment, in the sense that what might be intended as a tool of control, of exerting some pressure to guide you in the right direction, then because of the dysfunctions and the transformations that colonization, as you rightfully identified, has introduced into this context, the leftover, there's an aftertaste of this thing which is not showing up in the best possible way. And it's interesting that you mentioned the case of the women, because that ties in with the story I have in mind for us to talk about today. And this story is not from Cameroon. This story is from Senegal. I believe it's from the Wolof people of Senegal, because it was, or it is included in the Le Nouveau Conte d'Amadou Koumba, by Birago Diop. And Birago Diop is one of the greats of African literature, African folklore, African culture. And he wrote this story. He wrote this story into a book, but he actually heard the story first from their family griot. And it tells of the adventures of a young woman called Karigaye. And I'm going to summarize the story so we don't spend too much time on it. But the idea around it is that it's this young girl who grew up with her parents, was a loving family and everything, and then her mother passes away, so she becomes an orphan. So the classic orphan story, her father remarries and she gets an evil stepmother who had it out for her, treated her so horribly, but her mother had raised her well. Karigaye's mother had raised her well. And so despite her stepmother's maltreatment, she navigated her way through life. She didn't necessarily have a woman to guide her along the way into womanhood in the sense that would establish her well in the village. But she remembered enough of her mother's instruction that she was able to avoid the major pitfalls of girlhood. But part of that process was that she had an encounter as a young woman with a python at a well who helped her fetch water and carry her calabash back to the house. And this was a heavy calabash given to her by her stepmother. And so when she asked this python how she could repay him, he said, well, the time will come when I will return to take my payment. And so time passed and the girls were getting married and everything was falling into place for them, but not for Karigaye, until this python shows up again. And it turns out he's a prince, a majestic prince, a great man. So he sweeps Karigaye off her feet, marries her, and takes her to his kingdom found in a river. And so she is blissfully happy. They have children. Everything is perfect. But then she gets homesick because this is the village where she was born and raised. These are the people she knew, despite her stepmother's maltreatment and her father dying and leaving her alone. This was her home. So she gets homesick and she says, well, I would like to go back and visit my people. And her husband is not the monster that will show up sometimes in African folklore. He's a kind and benevolent man. So he says, well, you can go back to visit your people, but just remember that they might not see my kind as good. So it would be preferable if you don't tell them about your life here. Keep it quiet. And it turns out that Karigaye had 2 children with this man, and these children grew up in their father's lands. So they are not being oriented about the people in Karigaye's village. They didn't know the norms about discretion and things like that. So Karigaye goes back to visit with her children. And when the villagers saw her, they were surprised. We thought this, snake that came and carried you away was going to kill you. But look at you. You are big madam now. You've come back with your children. So they ask her about her life and she doesn't say a word. Probe, who is your husband? Who are his people? Normal questions that village people would ask because they are invested in how this daughter of their village turns out. Ask, Karigaye doesn't say a word. And so they corner one of her children, the girl. She has a girl and a boy. So they corner the girl and they ask her, what's going on? Who is your father? Who are your people? And because this poor child didn't know the whole situation, she tells them everything. She even tells them that they have the plan with their father, that when it is time for them to come back, this is where they are supposed to meet so that their father can take them back. But then the village people decide, well, we don't want this for this woman who's from our village. It's not right. It's not proper. And so behind Karigaye's back, they go and wait for her husband to come to take his family home. And when he shows up, they kill him. So Karigaye and her children leave to go back to their home and they find the man dying on the side of the river. And so he, in his benevolence, he tells the daughter, you didn't know what you were doing. You didn't realize what was going to happen. So this is what's going to happen to you. I think she turns into the euphorbia plant that will secrete water. And the idea is that that plant secretes water because it's the girl crying. And Karigaye was turned into a turtle dove that makes that call. Sounds like a person weeping. And that's because she's mourning her husband. And the young little boy who didn't do anything, didn't say anything, his father tells him to, go back to my people, stay there, don't ever come back here. And that's how the story ends. Any thoughts on this story?
What I can say is the villagers getting involved in Karigaye's life. She has lived with them, she leaves them, gets married, and comes back. The story would have ended well. But there's something. The villagers don't approve of her husband. They don't even know whether she has lived a good life with the man. They don't know anything about her life, but just the fact that they don't approve of her husband leads them to kill the man. And this goes back to that, how do I put it? The villagers say, this is our own, this is our own, this is our son, this is our daughter. This cannot happen. So they act spurred by their sense of unity, spurred by their sense of they think that they are protecting their child. They don't know that they are instead harming the child.
Right. And what I found interesting about this story is that her time in the village wasn't exactly blissful, right? There was the challenge of living with her stepmother who didn't treat her well, and that intervention didn't happen. You didn't necessarily, in this story at least, the villagers didn't rally to her side.
Sorry.
Even the challenge of lifting the pot and taking it back, it was this outsider who came and helped her. But then once they felt threatened by this unknown, then they were spurred to action. And that is something I think is worth noting, because remember when we started the conversation, in the case of the young men leaving to go work on the coast and the plantations, it was an unknown that would spur this idea that, okay, we are going to perform this act, this ritual to make you see the error of your ways. Or if it's a girl who turns away from the prospects of marriage that have been presented to her, the act is intended to help her see the errors of her way, to say, okay, you're not going to succeed in the way that you want to succeed until you see the wisdom in our ways. And there is that balance between care, between a desire for harmony, and how it misfires, so to speak. It goes off in a not particularly healthy direction.
Now, going back to that story, Kaigaya comes back a successful woman. Now let's put it in the context of the young man or young woman leaving the village. Hypothetically, if the young man goes to the coast and prospers and comes back to the village, he has proven them wrong. And the family now is blessed, let me put it in that context. He raises the families up.
Right.
Yes. And now they become an object of jealousy. So this movement of leaving the village and being cursed, you come back with success, it becomes another problem. Where the villagers now become jealous, and it goes back to that typical orphan child, wicked stepmother story. So it's quite a...
There is a complexity to it, which I think deserves close attention, because these are real life issues, right? We read them and they are folk tales, but I bet you can think of at least one or two stories from your life, your whole life, where something similar has happened, where maybe a person doesn't necessarily suffer dire consequences the way Karigaye does, but the thought that this series of misfortune in my life is because of this thing that is hanging over my head, it can become its own self-perpetuating narrative that gets in the way of you living a full life. And what I pay attention to nowadays is because, if you're in Cameroon, right, there are things you can do, whether you're choosing to seek help by going back to the village to right the wrongs, or if you say, okay, the ways of tradition are not for me, you're going to church, or however you choose to approach it. There are ways people navigate these situations, some successfully, some not so successfully. But now that unknown has expanded to include the world at large. And there is a dynamic that's interesting here, because to leave the African continent, to travel abroad, by and large is a good thing. People actively seek that. So it's the narrative has flipped from when people would leave and it would be seen as a bad thing. To leave is now considered a good thing. But this underlying psychology that you go and you are trying, and if you don't succeed, it's tied to something your village people. And when we talked about this before, when we talk village people, it's not necessarily the whole village. It's at the family level, the people who have an influence in your story, in the narrative around you. And so what I find interesting sometimes is that even though leaving, right, this transition, going into this unknown is now a desirable thing, it's a sought after thing, the psychology is still to catch up. Because more often than not, you will find that if a person does leave and faces challenge after challenge after challenge, there is this regression to the idea that, there is something holding me. My village people, and it's a joke. You hear people actually joke on it. Now, my village people will not succeed, in blocking my path, and we can laugh about it, but
it's serious.
It's serious because people are tormented. And if you find yourself in a context abroad where you don't have recourses that you can turn to, you don't have resources, then you could live a very difficult life, mentally, just psychologically, emotionally, spiritually disturbed, because you cannot reconcile the events of your life. And sometimes it's just life, the political context you're in, the social context, like I can imagine the economic context. I can imagine people in the US during the recession of the late 2000s, when the US economy crashed and people were losing jobs, businesses were shutting down, fortunes were vanishing. I can imagine a lot of people during that time having many conversations about the cascading misfortunes, and being African myself, having listened to conversations, whether it's a young man chasing success or it's a woman chasing success as defined by people in our cultures. You get married, you have children, and this and that, and this and that, and this and that. I worry sometimes that because we have this context out of which we are operating, which has not yet caught up to the context in which we actually live in, we let people suffer needlessly. Well, what are your thoughts about that?
You see, it all comes to what you hold on, what stabilizes you as a person.
Right.
If you grew up in Cameroon, become a young adult or an adult in Cameroon, and you come from a village or from a family that is close, very close to the village traditions, you cannot get rid of those thoughts.
Right.
And they will always be with you. What I think is, things happen in life, misfortunes happen in life. But if we are grounded in what we stand for, these misfortunes are inevitable and they don't always last. They pass by. It depends on your strength to stand on what you believe in and move forward. That's the way I look at it. Because you go back to the village, you did not do this for your father when he died, and this, that. You do it, and you come back, the situation does not change. How do you account for that? So the way I look at it is, be firm in what you believe.
And that's an approach that I endorse, because part of it for me is the narrative around the circumstances. This is not to say that these curses, if you want to call them that, are not real things.
They are real.
Because the way I see it, it's not, you can look at it from a metaphysical dimension, and that is entirely valid if that's the approach you want to take. But there is my brain is already thinking about, a social model, a dynamic model of social interactions where when you think about it, you come to a new place, a new land, a new city, a new country. The people most likely to support you, to orient you, to guide you, to help you, are your village people in that city, in that country, in that town, right? And that village, especially now in the diaspora, expands to include sometimes the people from your country or even the people from your continent. So it's family, village, town where you grew up, neighborhood, country, like there are dimensions to it. If it is known that these are the circumstances under which you left, this is the difficulty in your family, this is the strife, and this is especially when it's a close knit thing, and it is known that okay, your parents so disapproved of your choice to do XYZ, they declared that you will not succeed. Two things are most likely to happen. You'll either have people who don't want no parts with whatever that is, and they will keep away from you, in that process taking valuable support and opportunity away. Or you will have people who will say, you know what, we are invested in your success because we know you don't deserve this. Those are two ways this can go.
Yeah.
Now, if this is a context where the only people who happen to be around you are people who adhere to these traditions, right, and believe that you should go make right with your family without understanding the actual reasons, because it's easy to dismiss someone and say, oh, they are just stubborn, but each person knows the realities of their family, and sometimes, or their community, not even immediate family, sometimes the realities of their communities, and sometimes the person draws a line to say, well, I am not going to do XYZ and I have my reasons. You might find yourself isolated without support, triggering this vicious cycle where you face challenges and you don't have any help. You go through things, you're locked into this cycle of what's the word we just used, this cycle of what seems like bad fortune. But it's not because the mechanism at work here is just a lack of support, which you would say, oh, it's a curse, and you would not be wrong, but that's what's at work. And so I get very careful around these things because there are dimensions to it which, at the end of the day, for me, it is human dignity. It is a human life is bigger and more important than a narrative that needs to be preserved, especially when you think about the dynamics, because communities are not perfect, families are not perfect. And so the whole my village people thing, I thought it was very interesting because growing up in Cameroon, we are so inundated by media from Nigeria. My first thought was, oh, this was just something that people heard in a Nigerian movie. But then upon closer examination, I thought, there's something here. There is something here, and I wanted to talk about it because part of what I do here with Mythological Africans, as you well know, because we've talked about it 1,000,000 times, is to say, okay, these are the stories we have used to make sense of reality. How can we use these stories today to understand our present reality and craft new realities for the future we are going into? So my village people, however you choose to conceive of it, and the context will vary. The options any given person chooses to pursue, if this is a circumstance that they find themselves in. I think what I am arriving at is that there are situations that you run into as a person where the familiar might just not work anymore. You might need something other. And my hope is that by having these conversations on these episodes, people who are in the position, because the Mythological Africans community is big and varied, and there are professionals of all shades and stripes. And my hope is that by having these conversations, by putting references in the episode notes, people might be clued in to some realities that they might not be clued into, and can offer something to a person struggling with a situation like this. So we're pushing the 30-minute mark, which is longer than most of my Mythological Africans episodes tend to be. But any last words on this topic?
Villages are no longer what they used to be. More and more villages are becoming urbanized, and the worldview of the people are changing. When it comes to tradition, it's something the people hold on to maintain their identity. And from my observation in my own village, things are not as hard and as stringent as it used to be in the past.
Right.
They are making some allowances for the changing times. And in the cultural forum, there are discussions on the tradition, the practices, the rituals, and they are trying to make it more humane. And my hope is that, in as far as the dignity and the tradition and the integrity of the community has to be maintained, those who are at the core, holding the village together, holding the belief system, holding the cultural practices together, they should be open to changes that are more humane.
Amen to that. Amen to that. And so we will end here for the evening. I realize that we are barely scratching the surface of what this topic might cover, but I quite enjoyed this conversation, Mama, and I thank you for spending this evening with me. I hope you enjoyed the conversation if you're listening.
I did.
And I hope you come back again so we can talk about more things. Maybe we'll discuss one of your short stories or your poems. I'm going to plug it here. She has a Substack, but she's still working on it. And she'll be sharing her poems and short stories eventually, I hope. But keep an eye out. There's more to come from here. And so thank you all for listening. And I will see you next week.